There is something living inside certain walls, not a metaphor, not poetry, a biological organism, dormant, waiting inside the concrete around you for a single signal, a hairline crack, a thin thread of water. And when that signal comes,
it wakes up, does its job, and seals the damage from the inside out, without a single worker, without a single dollar spent on repair.
Without anyone even noticing. It has been sitting there the whole time, alive, waiting. You have walked past crumbling overpasses. You have seen sidewalks heave and split, parking structures wrapped in orange netting, tunnel walls stained with the rust of rebar bleeding through cracks.
You have paid for this pay through taxes, through tolls, through inflated construction budgets that never seem to solve anything permanently.
Researchers had already figured out a solution. Not in the future, not in theory, decades ago. This is not science fiction. This is not a startup pitch or a product no one has tested. This is documented, peer-reviewed, field-tested technology here. And the central question is not whether it works.
The central question is why you have never heard of it. Let's begin with what you already know about concrete, because what you know is probably incomplete. Concrete is the most widely used construction material in human history. More than 4 billion metric tons of cement are produced every year.
The infrastructure built with it, roads, bridges, tunnels, dams, hospitals, schools.
Not eventually, routinely. The shrinkage during curing, thermal expansion, ground movement, loading stress pondings, cracks are not failures of concrete. They are a fundamental property of it.
Anyone who has built anything with concrete knows this. The engineers know this. The contractors know this. The governments that commission billion-dollar infrastructure projects know this. And because concrete cracks, the world spends an extraordinary amount of money keeping it from falling apart. In the United States alone, the American Society of Civil Engineers
has estimated the infrastructure deficit at over $2.5 trillion, a backlog of deferred maintenance, repair, and replacement. In developing nations, where infrastructure was built quickly and cheaply to meet urgent needs, the deterioration curve is even steeper.
Coating, recoding, and ultimately replacing structures that cracked the way concrete always cracks, the way it is always going to crack. And the cycle repeats. Year after year, bid after bid, contract after contract. Now stop for a moment, because what I'm about to tell you is not a small thing. It is not a tweak or an improvement. It is a fundamental rethinking of what concrete can be, and it has been buried so quietly
beneath the noise of an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars that most engineers working today have never been trained to use it.
He was not a civil engineer, he was a biologist. And that outside perspective is probably exactly why he saw something the engineers had been trained to overlook.
The question was simple. Could biology solve what chemistry could not? Concrete fails because it is inert. It is a mineral matrix, strong under compression, tensions, brittle under tension, and completely incapable of self-repair. But living systems bone repair themselves.
What if concrete could do the same? Jonkers did not reach for nanotechnology or exotic polymers. He reached for life.
Specifically, he reached for bacteria of the genus Bacillus, a group of organisms with one extraordinary property that made them uniquely suited to this task. Bacillus spores can survive without water, without food, without oxygen, in extreme conditions, for periods of time that defy intuition.
Certain Bacillus species have been recovered from 250-million-year-old salt deposits and successfully revived. The Jonkers' insight was this: if you embed Bacillus spores into a concrete mixture before it cures, along with an organic nutrient compound, specifically calcium lactate, a calcium salt of lactic acid grove, the bacteria will survive the curing process in a dormant state and remain viable inside the hardened concrete for decades.
They need nothing, they wait. And when a crack forms tone, when water finds its way through that crack, activating both the bacteria and the calcium lactate, something remarkable begins. The bacteria wake up. They metabolize the calcium lactate, and as a direct byproduct of their metabolism, a crystalline mineral that precipitates out of solution and fills the crack from within, growing outward until the gap is sealed. Read that again, because the elegance of it deserves a moment. The bacteria do not act randomly. They act precisely where the damage is, because that is where the water is. And the water is what wakes them. The repair mechanism is targeted by the very phenomenon that causes the damage.
It is, in the most literal sense, a material that heals itself. Laboratory tests conducted at Delft between 1999 and
could close cracks up to 0.5 millimeters wide, a range that encompasses the vast majority of concrete cracks that lead to structural degradation. The calcite produced was chemically indistinguishable from the calcium carbonate in natural limestone with compressive strength.
under standard moisture conditions. In some trials, the full closure of cracks was documented in under 3 weeks. By 2015, Jonkers and his team had filed patents.
Published extensively, won the European Inventor Award finalist recognition, and produced a licensed product
into new concrete mixes or as a surface treatment for existing structures. Field tests were conducted on real infrastructure, a quay wall in Rotterdam,
a water treatment facility, a highway tunnel. In every documented case, the material performed, cracks formed. The results are not fabricated. This is not alternative medicine or fringe theory. This is applied microbiology, awarded by scientific institutions and commercially available. And yet, if you walk into most civil engineering departments at universities across the world,
a footnote in a materials science elective, not a standard curriculum. If you call most large concrete manufacturers, they will not have this on their price sheet. If you ask most government infrastructure departments whether they are specifying bioconcrete in new builds, the answer will almost certainly be no. Here is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because the question is no longer whether this works, the question is about what it threatens. The global repair and maintenance market for concrete infrastructure
is not a small industry. It is a multi-hundred-billion-dollar ecosystem that includes waterproofing compounds, epoxy,
membranes, and a vast array of professional services. Inspectors, applicators, structural engineers,
on construction repair and maintenance, a significant portion of which is concrete related. In Germany, infrastructure maintenance budgets run into tens of billions of euros annually.
These are not incidental expenses. They are industry, they are employment, they are revenue streams that flow predictably year after year because concrete keeps cracking.
And someone keeps paying to fix it. A material that seals its own cracks does not merely displace a product, it disrupts an entire service model.
It is not like switching from one brand of sealant to another. It is like switching from a car that breaks down constantly to one that repairs itself.
Which eliminates not just the garage, but the parts manufacturer, the tow truck company, the inspection service, and everyone downstream. The economic threat is not incremental. It is structural. Now, I want to be careful here, Taines, because this is not a conspiracy in the Hollywood sense of the word. There is no evidence of a coordinated, deliberate suppression of bioconcrete by a cabal of cement manufacturers. What there is instead is something more ordinary and in many ways more troubling.
systemic indifference. When a technology threatens existing profit structures, it does not need to be actively buried. It simply fails to find champions. Procurement departments do not specify it
because it is unfamiliar. Insurance underwriters flag it because it lacks a 50-year actuarial history. Public works commissioners avoid it because it exposes them to political risk if something goes wrong. And the companies that would need to retool their supply chains to adopt it calculate that the transition cost outweighs any short-term advantage.
The technology sits in academic papers and patent filings while the infrastructure around it continues to deteriorate on schedule.
At least not yet. The production cost of biologically activated concrete is currently higher than standard mixes. Estimates from 2020 put
above conventional concrete pricing at scale. For a single large infrastructure project, that is a meaningful upfront difference. The long-term calculation of maintenance cycles almost certainly favors bioconcrete, but infrastructure is often funded through short-cycle budgeting. The politician who approves the project is not the one who pays
for the repairs 20 years later, and that misalignment of incentives is not a small thing. Additionally, bioconcrete is currently most effective in structures exposed to moisture,
which covers the most critical categories: tunnels, water infrastructure, marine structures, underground foundations, but limiting.
In permanently dry concrete, they simply remain dormant forever, dormant without purpose. These are real constraints. And the central fact, for the classes of infrastructure where concrete cracking causes the most damage and the most expense, exactly the infrastructure that is collapsing across the developed world.
Right now, bioconcrete is a documented, functional, deployable solution, and it is not being deployed. Consider what it would mean in practice if it were. A highway tunnel lined from with biologically activated concrete would not need annual crack inspection surveys. A seawall incorporating bacillus spores and calcium lactate capsules
risks. A water treatment facility built with this material would not develop the subtle, invisible microcracking that allows chemical contamination.
Portfolio porching, and there are thousands of them higher, could spec bioconcrete for new construction and extend that infrastructure. They are the direct arithmetic of elimination. No inspection, no contractor call out, no traffic disruption, no
after year. The application is not complicated to understand. In new construction, the bacillus spores and calcium lactate are added to the concrete mix before pouring. No change.
Breaks in the pouring process, no special equipment, no additional labor. The bacteria distribute throughout the matrix and cure within it.
or immersion treatment carries dormant spores into existing cracks and pores where they settle and wait. The activation is entirely
No electricity. The only intelligence in the system is biological, and it has been running without error for hundreds of millions of years of bacterial evolution. What Jonkers built was not just a product. He built a new category of material hell, one in which the boundary between the living and the constructed is intentionally erased. It points toward
a future in which engineering draws not against biology, but with it, embedding organizing on bioconcrete variants that incorporate fungi rather than bacteria, producing mycelium networks that could exploring calcium carbonate precipitation in steel-reinforced concrete to simultaneously heal cracks and realkalinize the concrete.
Slowly can't, but it is moving, precisely because the core principle Jonkers demonstrated in Delft in the 1990s has proven to be
Where the bridges over your highways were built with a material that cracks by design, where the water mains under your streets are fracturing invisibly, leaching and wasting, where the
retaining walls and foundations and overpasses of the cities around you are scheduled for failure, and the only response available is to keep patching, keep sealing, keep spending, keep repeating. And you are also living in a world where the solution to this was documented in a laboratory before the turn of the millennium, where it was tested, validated,
awarded and published and where it remains 25 years later, a fringe specification that most of the people responsible for building your world have never been trained to use.
That is not a natural outcome. That is the outcome of an economic system in which perpetual repair is a revenue model and durable solutions are a threat.
It is the outcome of procurement processes that price the upfront dollar and ignore the lifetime cost. It is the outcome of engineering curricula that are shaped, subtly and not so subtly.
Work becomes a potential advocate, because every public official who understands the life cycle math can make a different decision on the next infrastructure tender. Because every citizen who knows this technology exists can ask loudly and persistently now why it is not being used on the bridge they drive across every morning. The concrete around you is not just a
material. It always was. And the choice to build infrastructure that deteriorates on a profitable schedule rather than infrastructure that heals itself was made quietly,
without announcement, over decades by a system that benefits from the crumbling. You now know that a different choice is possible, that it has always been possible,
and that the bacteria waiting in the walls of a few pioneering structures in Europe are patient enough to outlast any industry that refuses to wake up.
The question is whether the rest of us are willing to stop waiting with them.